Now, while world leaders were gathered in New York, Moscow has announced plans to hold referendums on formally annexing parts of Ukraine occupied by its forces and their separatist allies. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky's office says any such move would destroy the remaining chances for peace talks. The planned referendums announced today come after Ukrainian forces made sweeping gains on the battlefield in the east of the country, driving back Russian troops. Ukrainian presidential spokesman Andriy Yermak says Russia is showing signs of desperation, writing this on his Telegram channel. Naive blackmail with threats and horror stories of, quote, referendums and, quote, mobilizations from those who know how to fight only with children and peaceful people. This is what the fear of defeat looks like. The enemy is afraid. And for more on this, I'm now joined by Dr. Jade McGlynn. She is a senior researcher at the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies and author of the upcoming book titled Russia's War. She joins us from Oxford in England. Dr. McGlynn, good to have you on the day. Ukraine says Russia is sensing defeat. Is that really what's happening?
I think so, yes. The counteroffensive clearly took the Russians by surprise, and their inability, either their failure of intelligence in not expecting it, or their total inability to move enough troops around, or indeed to have enough reserves to fight back in any way effectively in the counteroffensive in Kharkiv region, suggests an army that is clearly not performing up to the propagandistic bombast with which it's often announced in Russia.
What would an annexation mean for the situation on the ground, for the people who could go from living in Russian-controlled territory to territory annexed by Russia?
This is very worrying because some of the territories, for example, Zaporizhia and Kherson, that are suggesting to be annexed are not entirely controlled by Russia. In fact, even Donetsk and I think even now Luhansk aren't entirely controlled by Russia. But with Zaporizhia, for example, the collaborationist authorities there have said that the whole of Zaporizhia will hopefully join Russia after these kind of sham referendum. But they don't even control the main city of the region, Zaporizhia itself. So then it leads us into some interesting questions where will the Russians think that the Ukrainians are occupying Russian land? It's just totally bizarre. And of course, the worrying thing is that it could be used as a way of, as an excuse for even more nuclear blackmail, i.e. threats of nuclear attacks, because, of course, if Russia sees that territory as Russia, then any attack on that territory could be used to justify a nuclear strike, or at least the threat of one.
Yeah, I want to read something to you that a former president, Dmitry Medvedev, wrote on Telegram today. He said, an encroachment on the territory of Russia is a crime that would warrant any means of self-defense. So do you believe this move to illegitimately swallow up Ukrainian territory could lead to an even greater escalation of the war, not only in Zaporizhia and around the nuclear plant, but in general, where we see Ukrainian troops trying to regain control of their territories and Russia treating it as an incursion into Russian territory?
Mm-hmm. I think first of all, of course, Dmitry Medvedev's transformation from sort of geeky liberal technocrat sort of 12 years ago into sort of terrifying warmonger is been quite the scene to behold. But I would also recall that he said a similar thing about attacks on Crimea on his Telegram channel. And then when the Ukrainians did attack Crimea, he deleted that Telegram post. So, you know, in a similar way, there was quite a lot of talk about what Russia would do if Sweden and Finland joined NATO, and that didn't really come to pass. So I definitely think because of the gravity and the horror of what we are talking about in terms of a nuclear strike, of course, we must tread very carefully, and we must, clearly we all have to be very sensible, because even if there's a 1% risk, such is the horror, that it's worth being very, very cautious indeed. However, I don't think we should just sort of bend and buckle to everything the Russians say. The Russians are clearly not doing very well in the war at the moment. Clearly, it does look like a tide has turned. The Ukrainian army is receiving, incredibly technologically superior weaponry to that which Russia has. the Russian army has. The Russian army is lacking in morale. The Russian army is lacking in its ability to get enough men. And so it's kind of natural that they would, of course, have recourse or decide to call upon their nuclear supremacy, which is something, that they mentioned quite a lot, even long before the war. There was quite a lot of references because, nuclear weapons is one of the few areas where Russia genuinely is a superpower, and it can really back it up with the hard figures.
The Russian parliament voted today to toughen the punishment for desertion and insubordination in times of military mobilization. How big of a problem does that seem to be among Russian troops?
I think it is a problem, but I personally have interpreted these laws more about the future and more about the possibility of either dangling the possibility of mobilization or because they are preparing for mobilization. And of course, it's always a fool's game to make predictions, especially in this war when everybody has been wrong at one point or another. But it does look like we have signs that if not a full mobilization, then perhaps a partial mobilization may be on its way. And in that case, of course, these laws would make it very hard for people to surrender or to go over to the Ukrainian side or to join any of the alleged sort of Russian pro-Ukrainian brigades that are now fighting in Ukraine as well.
Some analysts believe that these referendums that are now on the table are a way of trying to force Ukraine to the negotiating table. Do you think that would work?
No, mainly because of it's the feature that gets forgotten, I think, sometimes by everybody, which is the Ukrainians. Even if Volodymyr Zelensky wanted to go to the negotiation tables, and I have to say there's not much sign of that either, but even if he did, Ukraine, sort of what this is all about, Ukraine is a democracy, and I think it's 93% of Ukrainians are against making any concessions, even in Crimea, in order to secure peace. And I think it would be very hard to convince the Ukrainians as well that such a peace, and that you almost want to put it in scare quotes, but that such a peace would be enduring and that would be a peace for them, or would it just be a peace, for us in the rest of Europe and for the Russians?
Sure. So it's not going well for Putin, is it? And dissent among civil society is growing. Just last week, local politicians asked Putin in an open letter to resign for the good of the country. What's the extent of frustration with Vladimir Putin?
That's, of course, quite difficult to judge, and I wouldn't overstate that. I wouldn't overstate the level of frustration or protest. That particular protest as well was phrased in such a way where, of course, it was quite obvious to which Putin they were referring, but there was an element of plausible deniability to it. And I think that's kind of what allowed it to happen, was there was a sort of double entendre going on there. More generally in civil society, there are difficulties with trusting polls at the moment, but what I would say is actually a lot of the findings at the moment are quite ambiguous, and they suggest a sort of sense of a lot of Russians are just tuning off from the war. Even we can see this quite literally in terms of the television figures as well. People have just stopped watching the sort of the more propagandistic and bombastic shows. And there's a genuine feeling of kind of, well, not that they would agree to anything, that's certainly not the way to read it, but more of a, well, just, you've said you're going to do it, so just get on with it. Sure. And I think a general kind of apathy and not wanting to take responsibility for what's happening. But I would certainly caution against any interpretation that this is sort of Putin and the elite's war and the Russian people, it's kind of being forced on the Russian people. I don't think that would be a correct interpretation.
Okay, you are writing a book called Russia's War. Without any spoilers, how do you see it ending?
The war or the book?
Well, I think that kind of goes in unison, doesn't it? Both, if you want.
It does a bit, actually. First of all, I just submitted the manuscript last week, but first of all, I had a very depressing conclusion, and I just felt like it wasn't the right conclusion. And in the end, I changed it. And ultimately, I do think that this war will end in defeat for Russia in some form. And I think that defeat will lead very quickly to some sort of some sort of collapse. Now, when this will happen, that I do not know. But I think things will go quite quickly. But the way, but I do think that this is Russia's war. I think that this war resonates with people, and I think that broadly people, if they don't full on support it, then they acquiesce to it, they agree to it, they accept it without condemning it. However, I also think that Russia isn't doomed to be this way. I think that there could be, there could be a different Russia. Countries change, and I hope that in the future we'll see a Russia that is able to live at peace with itself and with its neighbours. But I don't really see the war ending until that change, until the Russians are ready to make that change. And I think that needs to be something organic and something that comes from Russia itself.
Dr. Jade McGlynn of the Monterey Initiative in Russian Studies, thank you so much for all that.
Thank you.